Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion.
Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Phil-Sci-Theo. This afternoon we are with Professor Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Oxford. Professor Dunbar is also fellow at Magdalen College, and he is fellow at the Royal Anthropological Institute. Thank you very much, Professor Dunbar, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
So could you please explain your research to us as simply as possible?
Oh, well, I guess I'm coming at this as much as anything from a general evolutionary biology, evolutionary anthropology, and even evolutionary psychology perspective, looking at social evolution in, I guess, mammals in general, but primates in particular, and certainly for the last 20 years, humans especially. And that one of the kind of key things that has emerged out of studying human behavior has, in the end, perhaps not surprisingly, been the nature of religion and the role it plays in creating bonded communities is perhaps the best way of thinking about it. And that goes back to my interest really is how species like humans and our primate cousins that live in very complex societies, unusually complex societies, let's say by animal standards, create these intensely bonded relationships that underpin these kind of communities that they live in, or that we live in, I suppose, which are not just aggregations. There's a distinction made in evolutionary biology generally between aggregations and congregations. Congregations not in the religious sense, but meaning the distinction of where animals just come together by accident, if you like, and form an aggregation like herds of antelope, let's say, on the plains of Africa or something like that. And the kind of distinction is with species that form congregations where the animals deliberately form a bonded group that is highly, highly stable through time, and is those bonds that are created, psychological bonds that hold the group together, are very, very intense. You don't see them very often in many species outside of monogamous pair bonds. And primates are unusual in having these large bonded groups where, you know, you are born, live your life and die mostly within the same small group or community. So, you know, we humans belong to that family. We just do it bigger and better than they do. And so my interest has been in trying to understand how we create these bonded relationships that underpin these really very complicated groups that these very small number of species, mostly primates, and obviously, of course, ourselves, have. And, you know, one of the features that emerges very clearly in the course of trying to understand what holds human social groups together turns out to be, well, you're not going to be surprised, many people might be, and that is religion. So what role does religion play in creating this sense of belonging to a community? And I suppose that's where I'm coming at this issue from.
Thank you. As you were speaking, I was wondering what your primary methodology is. How do you make observations, or do you have another way to study these aggregations and congregations?
I guess I come from a sort of tradition which has one foot in experimental psychology and another foot in zoology and observational studies, or indeed experiments in the wild on wild animals. So part of what I do is just looking at data that other people have, observational data that maybe other people have gathered, or we have gathered ourselves and trying to understand what's going on in a community of individuals. But equally, on the other hand, now have half a foot in experimental psychology, where, of course, experimental psychologists like to do experiments. These are sometimes extremely difficult to do in the wild, as you might say, in the natural environment on wild animals or humans in their everyday lives. It can be done, and we have done that. But most of those kind of studies are ethological in background and rely on just many hours spent observing. So we're now edging into the territory of anthropology and ethnography, as it were, of observing and studying communities of people. But on the other hand, there are questions we can ask by running experiments. Of course, they're much less, in one sense, much less rich than the kinds of studies you can make by observation alone, if you like, ethological observation or ethnographic observations, the case may be. But on the other hand, you can ask some very, very detailed questions by running experiments. So we've tried to do both. And also, we've tried comparative analysis, a very strong component of evolutionary biology in particular is the comparative method, which compares different species or within a species, as the case would be with humans, different societies for the kind of traits they exhibit, and you kind of shade into it when you're dealing within a species with things which are less genetically determined in the detail, but more the animals or the humans in this particular case, maybe figuring out what's the best way to do things. We know where we're trying to get to, what objectives we're trying to achieve. How do we go about doing it? So that whole approach can vary between, I suppose, absolute genetic determinism, which is what you're dealing with if you're dealing with most insects, probably, to a very free and easy learning experience and even thought through experience once you get up to humans. So, we try and take every possible opportunity for different methods of studying behavior once we get to humans.
Yes. Thank you. Your book, How Religion Evolved, was published recently. In its introduction, you say, for as long as history has been with us, religion has been a feature of human life. What kinds of scientific advances are there in support of this assertion? And I think we sort of anticipated it with you just speaking about your methodologies. But are there other scientific evidences or you have in support of this assertion?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I suppose the best evidence is tradition from different societies and the tradition within different religions. I mean, if you are thinking in terms of Christianity or maybe the Abrahamic religions more generally, there are, obviously the Bible, other written documentation that takes us back several thousand years, probably. And then, of course, once you get past what I suppose we ought to think of as history, you get into archaeology, and archaeologists have spent most of their time being very busy digging up things that either have to do with how people feast, because you can see sometimes the refuse they leave behind after their feasts, or what kinds of religions they have, what kinds of societies they have. So archaeology can take us back really a very long way, certainly in those terms, well back to around 10,000 years ago or so. But one of the central features of that approach, as much as anything, is the biologist's approach of using comparative analysis, so you can reconstruct past histories through comparing different species of animals, maybe, or different populations. So once we're into human territory, and what you might think of more as history, you can compare the historical development or evolution by comparing different societies or communities living near each other or far apart. The comparative method has been a very, very valuable source of information on allowing us to kind of reconstruct what are the minimum possible criteria. You're never going to get all the answers because people don't always bother to leave notes for you telling you this is what we do and why we do it now. You have to kind of figure it out from the refuse that they leave behind, and so it's an incomplete record. But we can do surprisingly well. You can't go back enormous depths, I don't think, with that sort of approach. You're dealing with archaeological time depths, which are sort of maximum perhaps of 10,000-12,000 years ago.
Yes, I know I know someone who's an archaeologist, and we've spoken in great deal about archaeological finds. And she usually says that archaeologists are reluctant to say what an object is for. So it sounds like evolutionary psychologists are the bridge between archaeology and our interpretation of what took place then in the past.
Yes, you could argue that. I think it would not be unreasonable. I think the bottom line is archaeologists have become very nervous in the last few decades of being too prescriptive, because in some ways they've had a bad press for just inventing explanations for the stuff they've dug up. But I think to be fair to archaeologists, at the end of the day, if you can't put an explanation onto something you see, then really you're not doing great justice to the material that these long distant folk have left us to look at. So if we're going to try and understand what's going on, we do have to offer explanations for what you see there in the fossil record or the archaeological record. Of course, they may well be hedged around with ifs, thens, and howevers, but still, we have to have a best guess at it, and sort of the whole process of science and knowledge is that as we acquire more knowledge of anything, in fact, any discipline, we can refine our views and opinions and hopefully get closer and closer to the truth.
Yes. The approach you take in how religion evolved differs from traditional theological, historical approaches to the study of religion, and even to contemporary cognitive and neuropsychological examinations of religious behavior. How does the approach in how religion evolved differ from these traditional and contemporary approaches?
I suppose that the biggest difference is where I'm starting from, if you like. So my interest in the role of religion principally is in how it bonds societies, how it gels a community so that they can act together and get the best out of life, as it were. So I'm kind of much less interested in the theology. I know other people are better qualified than me, for sure, to deal with that. I'm happy to leave it to them. There are aspects of the psychology which I personally am not qualified to deal with, so I'm happy to leave those bits to people from the relevant disciplines. I'm much more interested in the role that religions have played in the past, and indeed, of course, as much now, in bonding communities together, creating a sense of belonging so that people can, a group of people, a community, can do the best that they can under the sometimes pretty grim circumstances that the world throws at them and tests them with, as you might say. That the whole sort of basis of my approach is, it stems out of the evolutionary biology and psychology of group living in particularly species like primates and then obviously humans, that living in a community has been their major evolutionary strategy. That's how they cope with the exigencies that are thrown at them by this miserable world that we sometimes live in, you know, and it's that communal solution to the problems of successful survival and reproduction that are the core of my approach. So I'm happy to remain neutral on, if you like, the theology, because I'm not necessarily see that as being instrumental. Yeah, you might argue that some theologies are rather better than others. For obvious reasons, but I'm happy to leave that to theologians to argue about. All I'm interested in essentially is how religion has enabled the successful survival of communities in the face of the sometimes terrible circumstances that life and the world throws at them, and just the sense that their solution or our solution is very much a communal one. It's us hanging together, right? So the question is, how do we do that? How does religion enable that to happen? And what are some of the interesting sort of features of religions that emerge out of that perspective? That's really where I'm coming from.
Yes, well, that leads very nicely to the next question, which is, how does religion do that? One of the ways I think, I'm just going to take a stab at the question first. One of the ways is maybe because religion is one of the ways we try and make meaning of the world. And I wonder what you think about that. And then do please say how you think religion enables survival and maybe flourishing.
I go along very much with that suggestion. It's certainly the case that religion gives meaning. It's clear that it does a lot of things all at the same time. The meaning side really is clearly very important because it provides some sense of communality, you know, why we should be sticking together as a community. Of course, you know, the problem with that is there's a slight downside that you might already have noticed, which is, you know, my religion is better than your religion. But that's another issue, I think. And one of the sayings of wisdom in evolutionary biology is there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everything that evolves for a good purpose always ends up with having a bad purpose somewhere around the edges of it. So anyway, clearly this sense of we're all in this together, and you know, we have to help each other out, if you like, it is central to the success of communities and therefore the individuals that make them up. And religion clearly plays a very strong role in that. But there is and then there are sort of all sorts of questions about how religion not exaggerates, not the word I'm looking for here, but how religion makes possible this sense of belonging and community. Because the key to the evolutionary success of all the primates as a group, and therefore of humans in particular, has been their capacity to create these bonded social groups where in some sense, everybody's looking out for everybody else within the group, right? So that's really the core to their story. And religion turns out to be just one of, as we understand it anyway, one of the feet on the many-footed stool of things we do and are capable of that create this sense of belonging and bondingness and brotherliness or sisterliness amongst the community that allows us to behave in an altruistic kind of way, if you like, pro-social way. So there is that sense in which religion's playing a very important role. Very clearly, it's not the only one. It turns out to be one of a set of behaviors which are unique to the humans pretty much, as all of them, because a number of them depend on language, that enable us to create these very intensely bonded communities. So we can come back to that if you're interested in pursuing it. But religion is they're what I refer to as the 7 pillars of friendship. 7 mechanisms that are involved in creating a sense of community, which allows us to solve the problems of how to survive in the world as a community rather than as a bunch of selfish individuals. Yeah, I think the way in which religion becomes important is actually quite interesting, because most of the mechanisms that we use regularly for creating these unusually strong bonded relationships that we have, and that's a primate characteristic, but in the context of humans, because we're dealing with much bigger groups, most of the mechanisms are quite straightforwardly pharmacological. They trigger the endorphin system in the brain, which gives us this sense of calmness and relaxation, and all's well with the world and everything's at peace, and you're my best friend when I do these things with you, creating this sense of community that they're all quite interesting in themselves, because again they're quite unique to humans primarily anyway. Things like laughter, singing and dancing, the rituals of religion in particular, feasting together, and telling very emotional stories. Now, what kind of strikes me about all these intrinsic mechanisms that create this sense of belonging to a community or bonding by triggering the endorphin system in the brain is actually they're all of them in one form or another there in the bases of different religions. I mean, maybe they're not all there at the same one, but you think of laughter and the Toronto blessings kind of things that you come across, obviously singing and obviously dancing, because there it is in the Bible with David dancing before the tabernacle, wasn't it, right? Yes. Feasting, and you think of sort of certainly in the Catholic tradition of the Mass is perceived as a kind of sacrificial feast, and you have you have the sacrament and so on. And of course, emotional sob stories, as you might describe them, that's probably the history of most, not only the Bible itself, but also, if you look at the accounts of saints through the ages, it's mostly coping with crises of one kind or another. So, and a lot of the things we do in religious services and so on, like dancing or singing or praying in synchrony or moving in different ways, standing up, kneeling, sitting, and so on, in particularly doing that in synchrony as a group, trigger the endorphin system and create this sense of belonging and bonding, and seems to be very important to doing that. But this is kind of, if you like, the underpinnings of this sense of religiosity that creates a sense of belonging and sense of community. And of course, makes you behave better, at least to the members of your community. Sometimes, hopefully, to people who aren't in your community, but at least as far as your community are concerned, you makes you feel warmer towards strangers. And sorry, getting too enthusiastic here. Makes you feel warmer towards strangers and those who are less fortunate than yourself, for example. All these kind of things that provide, in many ways, the everyday meat and drink of religions, as it were. But then also that you think of the extent to which storytelling in some form, in the sense of parables or whatever, people's good deeds, the good deeds of the saints or anybody else, provide a sense of uplifting, warmth, and this is how we should behave, and these are our models that we should follow. All these things are part of the same suite of things that we use for creating a more secular relationships, just pure friendships, and amongst ourselves and in our sort of wider communities. So in some sense, they're not, I don't think, especially specific to religion, but it's clear that religious services in particular, exploit a lot of these mechanisms. What does strike me about the cases where religion is involved is it really seems to ramp the effect up much, much more powerfully. There's something that okay, we can sing some jolly song and enjoy ourselves, but there seems to be an added benefit that comes through singing a well-known song, we call them hymns, in the context of a religious environment or a religious service that is much more uplifting and is much more bonding, that you come to feel. That's, I'm sure, why the kind of brother and sister terminology that you find so much in Christianity and the Abrahamic religions generally, I guess, is there, because you have this sense of, we go to a service, we do various things in the service, various things happen, and it creates this sense of belonging and bonding in what is a very kind of brotherly and sisterly sort of way. So those kind of things appear to be what sets religion apart a little bit, or a religious framework to these quite everyday kinds of activities that we do. Yes. And they're all there. I mean, some religions, a communal meal is part and parcel of that. The Sikhs will always finish the big service with a communal meal, and I suppose in Christianity it's there in a symbolic form, in terms of in communion service.